welcome to Episode 7, The Living Room, Part 2. The Living Room, Part 2. And this is the book called The Gray Stage by Greg Fernandez, Jr. We'll be reading through certain pages today of this. The section we're covering today is going to be Chapter 5 in the book, which the Chapter 5 is called The Living Room. And today we'll be starting, if you're following in at home, on page 37. With us today is Greg Fernandez, Jr., the author, and also researcher Catherine Michelle. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, this will be interesting because this chapter, Greg, as I think it was wise to break it up into several parts. There's so much here, and I see that you'll be having it up on the screen as well for those following at home. The page numbers are different on the PDF file, but I'll be reading from the book here. But there's a lot to cover here, and each one of these paragraphs is important as well. I mean, extremely important. Do you agree, Catherine?
Absolutely. Yeah, we could probably spend the entire time on just this.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover here. So, and hopefully we'll have others joining in on the chat room, and possibly asking questions and commenting. And if not, feel free. You do not have to provide comments or engage, but certainly feel free, as there's a lot to cover here, and hopefully can provide some insight on there. Today is July 26, 2020, and it's episode 7, part 2. So I'll start off with page 37. There's a paragraph called Cartridge Casings. Based on the firearms report completed May 22nd, 2015, the gun, item 1A, fired 6 cartridge casings and 6 bullets. Item 2 is a cartridge casing found at the corner of the east edge of the carpet, near the recliner. Item 3 is a cartridge casing found on the east side of the living room, hardwood floor, next to a short wooden stool. Item 9 is a cartridge casing found on the south side of the living room carpet. Item 30 is a cartridge casing found on the living room hardwood floor closest to the south wall. Item 36 is a cartridge casing found inches from David's left hand on the south end of the living room carpet. And item 37 is a cartridge casing found on the west side of the living room carpet next to a couch. And so that gives us the location and the numbering sequence of each of the table tents for the investigators that they set up next to each item. Where would you like to start here on this one, Greg?
Well, obviously, I think the main thing here is to see where each casing was found, and can that help us understand where each person was shot, where the shooter was standing, whoever the shooter was, where the shooter was standing, and does that help us understand that?
And maybe
so that was my big question.
And before we start with that, Catherine, do you want to explain to the viewers, and some may be newer, we're getting lots of members to the group, the difference between a bullet fragment that was fired from the weapon and a bullet or cartridge casing that gets ejected from the handgun? In this case, it's a .40 caliber Springfield handgun that's used here in the case. But what is the difference, if you were to summarize the difference so the listeners can get a visual?
Okay, the casing is just that. It's the metal jacket, so to speak, that holds the projectile. And once the firing pin hits that projectile, it kind of shoots out the projectile. The casing, then it comes out of the casing, which then becomes the bullet projectile. And once it hits something and then either shatters or mushrooms or does whatever it does, that becomes the fragmented piece. And then the part that then was holding that, so it could be fired, is then ejected out of the gun safely, and that is called the casing. So, and generally, Yeah, I'm sorry. And generally speaking, the casings will eject in a pretty predictable pattern, maybe a foot or two, sometimes 3 feet away from the gun where it's being held. And it usually ejects to the right. Or if you're left hand, it will eject one side or the other. And so it can, as long as those casings are not moved, you can come within a certain amount of certainty where the person was standing who fired the gun. When you combine that with the entry patterns and stuff like that on a victim, where a bullet actually entered a body or a surface. I think we're gonna, where it's on the floor, they would be, if they had done the trajectory path, they could have told everybody exactly where the shooter was standing when that bullet was fired into the floor, but they did not do it.
Okay, so we've got 6 here, and this is where they were found when police came. The 6 cartridge, the casings that were ejected, and we'll get next on the next section into the actual bullets and the fragments themselves that were fired, or the projectiles. But here, the important thing here is that there is 6. We don't have reason to believe that they were moved, but we have to put a but there once again. We can't look at anything in this case and assume anything in a case like this. But a typical situation, if David did all the firing and shot himself to end his life after killing everybody, there would be no reason or no motivation to move or handle or do anything with these. Now, if the killers came in, which we think is probably most likely the case, they also probably wouldn't have had a reason to move or alter or handle any of these either, although we can't rule that out. But right now we're going under the assumption that this is actually where they left. And like you said, in a uniform, consistent pattern, they'll eject either to the left or the right. And this is all the same handgun, so we can kind of help narrow down where the killer or killers were standing when whoever it was firing the weapon. Is that a fair analysis for the listeners?
Yes, and also I've gone back and watched some of the videos that David recorded of him. I believe it was him and Danny August Mason, they're just out target practicing. And I have watched the trajectory of where the casings ejected from the gun, and they always ejected to the right, maybe about 2 to 3 feet from where they were fired.
Okay.
So my big question for the police officers would have been the casing that was found near the window. I believe that's the south wall. Is that the one that was by the window on the floor?
That's the south wall. That's the family.
Yeah.
The window was on the south, yes.
Okay, yeah, so that means that the person who fired it had to have been standing facing probably close to the Christmas tree, so to speak. They would be in that direction. So, it should be obvious to the police that where these casings were found do not match up with someone who's, committing murder-suicide, because they're trying to, from what I read in the reports, the police reports lead me to believe that they feel the bodies lie where they were shot. And these casings prove the exact opposite. There's, how do they explain that casing getting over there when his gun ejects to the right, and that is clearly way far to the left next to a window, and the bodies are way over to the right, 4, 5, 6 feet away, so, maybe more, 7 feet away. So.
And we do believe that when the investigators got there, I don't think that much thought was put into. I think that they were in the habit of retrieving those cartridge casings, and the next goal should have been matching it up with the number of bullets found, and then a true investigator then would take the next step to start doing the math and the geometry as far as where they were fired, where they were found, and where they ejected to. But in this case, I think they just found where they were, they packed up and left and thought David did it, assumed he did it and left. And what we'll get to later in the show is that the numbers don't even match, which is red flag number 1. But the first part of the show is just the casings. So, Greg, do you want to go? Should we go through the where they're located, or one by one, or which one belongs to which person? I know at one point we did a little matrix of these 6 casings, and the number on the investigative table tents, along with matching up with where the bullets themselves, the projectiles, went, and we kind of matched them up there. And that's what I found that I had to do, and other listeners might be the same way, where they want to match it up to see what went where, but as far as helping with a visual. But we can start at any point here. We've got them all numbered in the book. Greg, you've got them bolded, each of the items, as far as where they were, and we could go through which, by the location of the casing, which body it was related to, or where that one ended up. Or should we continue on to that next section in the book and then come back and tie these numbers out? What's your recommendation?
Whatever would be less confusing for the viewer, I guess, for someone who is, who doesn't know anything about this, trying to get a good understanding of it, of where each casing was found. Maybe we just go and start there.
All right, and that makes sense. I have 2 questions or comments here before we move on, and maybe this will spur some more comments in the comments section as well. And maybe, hopefully, Catherine will have an idea with this. It rang a bell to me when she mentioned where that one was first found. And what I've got is 2 questions. Item 36 is actually a cartridge casing found inches from David's left hand. Now, the reason that jumps out to me is, Catherine, you had just finished saying that that it'll eject out probably 1 to 2 to 3 feet away. It just wouldn't be inches, and so that is question number 1 that I have, unless it relates to the firing of another of the bullets. But there wouldn't be a situation where it would land just inches from your hand. Now, we do know that David was right-handed, and the fact that this was near his left hand, which is also where the weapon was, raises another whole slew of questions. but that's my first topic. Now, the second one is let's see, I had 2 questions, and boy, I just think I forgot it here.
Well, can I address the item number 36 real quick?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Okay, and when you see on the screen here where Greg is pointing to where item number 36, the casing, was found, and then 30, which is the one that was close to the wall and the window, I mean, these are the perfect examples of what I'm trying to point out to others. And you are correct. How did that get inches from his hand? Especially since his gun ejects to the right. Where these casings are found clearly show that a person was standing facing the exact opposite direction of where the bodies were lying. The bodies were lying sort of northwest. The person had to have been standing southeast. So, they're directly behind them, according to this drawing, and where they're finding these casings. And so you're absolutely right. It doesn't make sense. If their narrative, if they want their narrative to be right, they need to explain how that happened. And I don't see anywhere where they've explained how any of the casings ended up where they are. Just, again, does not make sense.
And I'm guessing, too, I just remembered my other point, but I'm guessing, too, if any of those had fingerprints, or if they were handled as far as staging, my first bet would be the one laying inches away from his hand was more than likely the one placed there on purpose in the staging of all this. The others, they may not have went through the effort to do that, but obviously someone laid it right there, because it doesn't really make sense at all. The other thing I was thinking of for the newer listeners out there and the newer members, and who may not be gun enthusiasts per se, these casings, because they'll jump out and they're round, if they land on the hardwood floor, there's also potential to roll and end up somewhere that they may not have landed. But the ones that landed on the carpet or something like that, it's going to relatively be where they ejected out. Now, when we get into the bullets, that's where those can be lodged some places, or ricocheted or bounced, but the casings themselves are just going to land where they land. But in the case of a hardwood floor here, the ones found on the hardwood floor may have done some rolling to get to their final destination, would they not?
Correct, a little bit. They wouldn't have
Okay.
traveled too far, but you were right, and they could have bounced a little and then rolled a little, but it wouldn't have been too far. About where they land is still going to give you a pretty good general idea of where the person was standing when the weapon was fired. I mean, if you can't pinpoint it exactly because of the reasons of what you just said, but again,
Okay.
if the casing is way far to the right, that up or whatever, the person can't be standing down where they have him. That's okay. That was confusing. Never mind that example. But I think you get it.
But we do know that all the shots were fired in that living room. If we assume that, there's nothing as far as casings found in other areas of that house. And if they were planted, they were all planted there. But everything is consistent here with the living room as far as where they were found. And so the first question for if you were for the new listeners and new members out there, we do know that 3 people were found dead in that home. So right off the bat, there might be questions with those just following the case now is, why in the world would there be 6 to begin with? Why would there be 6 at all? Were people shot more than one time? And we're looking at the autopsy results with Rania, the 5-year-old daughter. There only is 1 bullet that went through her body. And so she was only shot once. David was obviously only shot once, if that's all that we know of, and the official narrative said he did it himself. But Comel is a different story. There are 2 gunshot wounds in her head and 3 bullet fragments that have her blood on it. So we know that she was shot 2 or possibly 3 times. If she was shot 3 times, we know that Rania and David were shot once apiece, and we know 1 bullet was down in the basement. So that at least matches up. It at least matches what could have been. If she was only shot twice, we are still off by 1 potentially. So that might be the introductory question for some of the folks that are newer following this case. I know the case is 5 years old, but we're getting a lot of new people. The math right off the bat might be hard, but I think when we get into this next paragraph in this next chapter, it may start to make a little more sense, perhaps.
I've been looking into this for 5 years now, and I'm still confused about a lot of this. So I sent you both a little rambling, trying to understand, exactly what was found where. Why aren't these bullets matching? Because when I first read the 94 pages, I thought the math added up. I thought it added up. You have 6 bullet casings and you have 6 bullets. Any way that you slice it or dice it, it's just not working out. There's something missing. There's something, there's definitely something missing there. So just looking at also what is tested, I need you guys just to clarify for me, because I have this one question about this. You don't test casings, is that right? Because obviously we're looking at here, it doesn't look like there was any testing done on these casings.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. They generally do not test the casings.
Do you know why? Do you have any idea why they wouldn't test the casings?
That I do not know. That's a good question. So I'm sorry, I don't know that.
I think and I don't have a background in this at all, but I think, Catherine, the testing would be limited to grabbing 1 or 2 of the 6, or maybe even all 6, and then matching that up with the firing pin of the weapon to make sure that the weapon found at the scene actually fired those bullets, which ejected out in the firing pin. But I think there's nothing else to do as far as investigating that. It's more important to come up with the match, the number of bullets at the scene of a crime and the bullet casings. But I agree that there's nothing to really research, unless if you're looking at fingerprints or if there's any prints on those. There never should be a fingerprint, I guess, really on the casing.
Well, Well, it is like when you pick
When
it
you
up and
handle it.
load it. So
Yes.
yeah,
So you would have it at that point, but not after the fact. But that's
yeah, you
that's as
should.
far as I don't know if there would be any type of investigation. The investigation would be heavily on the bullet, on the fragment itself, on the projectile, because that tells you everything that you really need from a fact-based investigation as far as the DNA, the blood, the contents, who it came from, what swabs you can take from that. But as far as the casings themselves, there's nothing really there to do anything with. If that
Correct, and to keep in mind that the lands and grooves are in the barrel of the gun, and the projectile is what goes through there and then picks up those grooves and those markings,
Yes.
and the casing itself is just ejected. But yeah, I agree with you.
Now, as far as how they're numbered, how they're labeled, I'm just going to pull up this map here. And please let me know if anyone in the chat room, if you're still hearing me echoing, I'll definitely fix that. But what I'm looking at right now, where is it? So, okay, so is there any reason why number 2 is labeled number 2, whereas you have some of these other bullets and other things, casings that are found closer to item 1? I'm just kind of wondering, do they just go by where they first find it, where whatever they see first? How do they number these casings?
Good question. I cannot answer that. Captain, do you have a...
I have no idea either. Their numbering, it makes no sense. There's no rhyme or reason to my brain anyway. I mean, it may make perfect sense to them, but yeah, I'm with Dan. I have no idea.
And maybe they work from the inside out, but like Greg said, that doesn't make sense either because some were actually found closer. But I think they label the evidence, and they're at that point they are just going along with those yellow table tents and setting things down. And the key to remember here is once they set them down by the item, then it can no longer be changed, because then they're locked in. That number is that number forever. Item 7 is always going to be 7 for the entire investigation. So I don't know if there's a rhyme or reason as to how they come up with those, or they just start setting things down. But that's
because there's so much evidence in the living room, and then they go from item 1, where the gun supposedly was located, and then jump to almost the kitchen. It's like, wow, okay. So I don't get it.
Right, because item 36 and item 37 are at least 36 is a lot closer to item 1. But I guess if they're entering from the kitchen area, maybe that's why they see number 2 first, they see 3 second. We can see where number 9 is. So maybe maybe there is a rhyme or a reason to it. I was just curious about.
And perhaps two detectives each grab, the first guy grabbed the first 10, and the next guy grabbed the next 10, and they started laying them down out of perhaps out of sequence. But I don't know how that is figured in.
Oh, Greg, it makes perfect sense what you just said. If I'm following pattern now. Okay, now it makes sense to my brain. Yeah, if they're coming in through the back door, and if they're going to be numbering, who knows? Maybe their first item was to start putting down the flags next to the casings. That was their first one, or I don't know. But when you look at it on the screen and then the numbers, it does go in sequence from the back door. So that's interesting. That could be what they did.
Okay. I think the echo is now gone, hopefully. Okay, so then you have okay, so they don't do any testing on these casings, so there's we're just gonna note where these casings are found. You have item 2, you can see where item 2 is found. Then you have item 3, which is behind the recliner. It's kind of an interesting area where item 3 is actually found, where that casing is found. Now, there's no way to tie each casing to these bullets either, right?
Correct.
So it's a lot of guesswork. And again, if we're going back to show that within 24 hours, there are, or we could say 4 to 24 hours. You know, they're already thinking cases is solved. They have their suspect, etc., etc. Before they have any of this stuff, before they have any of the DNA, and before they even have all of the bullets and maybe all of these casings too. But so we have 6 casings that they find. So that's item 3, item 2, item 3, item 9, item 30, item 36, and item 37. So based on that, we can guess that they are assuming that there were 6 shots.
Correct.
So they
Yes.
so they must be looking for 6 bullets to match those shots. And there's no reason why they wouldn't, as far as I'm concerned. And that was the most troubling thing, is that they are very clear on what they found, here. So that's all I have on the casings. If you want to move on, unless you have anything else on those casings.
No. I'm moving ahead now to page 38 for those following along, called spent cartridges. The spent cartridges found on the west side of the living room carpet on January 17th, 2015 are labeled item 42, 43, and 44. And so we've got 3 already of the 6, and keep in mind now for the newer listeners that they are different numbers. Now these are separate pieces of evidence, the casings and the bullets themselves. All 3 spent cartridges were found close to the living room couch with hair on them. Test results for all 3 showed a single source DNA profile matching Comel, David's wife, while excluding Rania and David as possible contributors. So this is where I meant earlier, of the 6, we've got 3 bullet fragments that relate directly to Comel. And so this leads us to the evidence supports that she was shot 3 times, one could argue. Anything more on that, or should I continue to the next paragraph?
Well, can I point something out here? In these, all 3 of these, like you just state, and what Greg puts is these were the fragments that had Camel's DNA. Now, when you look at the map, or the little sketch drawing, their CAD drawing, it shows that item 40, yeah, you were just there. Yeah, item number 43. There you go, yay! Item number 43 is that fragment is to the left of where Camille was lying, and she was shot left to right. So if that had exited the right side of her temple, why is that fragment on the left side of her body? And I believe item 44 was underneath her body. So how does that happen? And again, same thing. They don't explain any of this. I mean, right away you're looking at this going, wow, there are a lot of problems with their theory and their narrative. And I would really like it if they could explain it, because again, maybe I'm just not understanding their process. But from this point, and looking at it from this direction, item 43, that fragment should not be to the left of her body, because if it still contained hair and blood and tissue, I highly doubt that the dog licked it and picked it up and dropped it. I know a lot of people tend to blame the dog for everything, but I don't see how that would be possible. So,
is that more proof that that Camel's body was moved at some point?
That's my stance, yes. To me it shows that she was definitely moved, because where these fragments are landing, it does not make sense with her body position.
And we have to keep in mind too that her arms were underneath her body in a crisscross fashion or something, which is also not the way that you would fall if you were shot in any type of scenario. Would it not?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
The other weird thing that I think about these bullets is that they mention item 31, so they call item 42, 43, and 44 bullets, but item 31 is called a bullet fragment. So I was thrown off about that too. So is item 31 a piece of 42, 43, 44, or is it still considered its own bullet? Because if it is, then why don't they say that they found 4 bullets instead of 3?
I think Catherine should answer this one.
And I'm not ready to say that, oh, wow, that's a great question. I didn't catch that. And you know what? I don't have an answer. I think that's something that they should answer. But in the photos, does it look like a really large fragment itself? I mean, like the rest of them? Or does it really look like just a piece?
It really looks like just a piece, and I think I have an image here in the book. Let me pull that up here for the viewer. But it does look, if you compare the images of those bullets, it does look very different. I'm getting here to it. It does look very different from item 31. Item 31 almost looks kind of smashed in. I don't know how else to describe it. But it's a very curious bullet fragment compared to the other 3. So that's, again, it's like, okay, even if you add in item 31 as a 4th bullet, the numbers still are not adding up. So yeah, everybody, I'd love to get people's views on that, about what item 31 is. Is it, I mean, we have to assume, based on what they're saying, on what they're writing here, that it is not, item 31 is not a bullet. It must be a fragment. I had wondered if maybe item 31 was maybe part of item 45, the one that shot into the ceiling, because of where item 31 is found, going back to this map here, is very similar to where the defect in the rug is that goes into the floor and goes down into the basement. So,
but is it, with the amount of hair that I saw in that photo that you just had, and what was entwined in that fragment piece, you can see it, and yet 45 has nothing. They can find. Sorry, hold on a second, my neighbor.
So for the listeners out there, keep in mind that these are hollow point bullets, 40 caliber, and so what they do is, when fired, they will shoot out and then hit something, come into contact with whatever it is it's hitting, and then mushroom out. And so, and that would be the bullet or the projectile or the bullet fragment. Now, what Greg is talking about here is possibly the bullet or the projectile splitting off or splintering, and you may find several fragments of that same bullet projectile that had come off or became no longer part of that same object. So we could have more than multiple fragments of that bullet splintering off and breaking off and landing in different spots. That's what Greg is talking about. Is that correct, Greg?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that could explain where the numbers of the things do not add up. There might be one that broke off. Now, I know it does look like that your next paragraph, Greg, you go into detail about how much they weighed, the grams, and maybe that would help us with this section as well.
Yeah, if you want to read that that paragraph, I'll pull that up here right now too.
Okay. So item 42, this is the one that had Comel's blood. Item 42 weighed 167.96 grams, contained a blood-like hair, and a hair-like substance, with expanded damage to the nose of the spent cartridge. So now we get into item 43. This one weighed 179.56 grams and also had a blood-like substance, but no hair. The nose of the cartridge was damaged and partially exposed. A blood-like substance was also observed on item 44. This spent cartridge weighed 130.24 grams, with its nose listed as damaged. So the first two, item 42 and 43, were roughly the same as far as weight. The third one, item 44, is much less.
So that really does kind of give credence to what you're saying, Greg, that maybe a piece of that one did fly off somewhere, and it's all the same bullet. It's just fragments.
But it would have to be one of the bullets close to where item 31 is, right? And the only one that's even close is 43. And 43 weighed 170. So 43 weighs the most. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Even item 45 is, you know, if it was part of item 45, that's still, it's one of the.
Or it came. Well, 44 is the one that weighed the less, so that 31 could have come from 44.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
There's 44 and there's 31. But then again, you know, if fragmented and they're moving the body, did they step on it and did it get on their shoe? I mean, we don't know, and it's really hard to tell, you know.
Right. We can only see where item 44 was, and I'm circling that here next to where Kamel's body was found, compared to where item 31 was, which is all way on the other side, closest to the south wall, on the other side of David. So that fragment would have had to have done a hop, skip, and jump all the way over the knife, over the gun, over the blue blanket, over all of that stuff in order for it to make sense. Even if item 31 is tied to item 45, the bullet found in the basement, it's still not adding up for me.
Yeah, I don't believe 31 is associated with 45, because 45 would have to be pretty much intact the moment it hit that carpet and then hit the floor. I can't imagine it going through hardwood floor, through, you know, the ceiling, although it's just, you know, very simple tiles, and then into a drywall. And so it would have to have some major velocity to do all that. And if it was actually 31 and 45 were the same, that meant it hit something first. It hit her body first before going through the floor, and I don't think it would maintain any of that momentum if that had happened. But you're bringing up such a great point. And again, this just leaves the question wide open, and they don't look at this. Her body is feet and feet away. Her head is feet away from where that fragment is found, and on the opposite side of where the bullets were, you know, ejected from her head, and they don't question this at all.
Right.
Yes, thank you.
Disturbing, very disturbing. So I'm pulling up just the sketch drawing of where kind of Kamel's body was, so we can see where the top of her body was compared to where this item 31, which is way over on the other side. It's, you know, even 42. I think, well, okay, well maybe it's tied to item 42. That's on the other side of David too. There's some weird. There's a lot of problems with that. Lots of problems with that. That makes it hard for me to try to justify what they're saying here, which is what I've been trying to really do. It's not working out. It's not working out at all. The weight, so that was the main thing about putting in the weight of these bullets, is to try to see which one it could possibly, that item 31 could be tied to. And even Derek in our chat room is saying he thinks 44 seems like the most likely one.
Yeah.
But again, there's a problem with that distance is the only thing. I don't know if item 31, doesn't look like I have the weight of item 31, but you can tell it's definitely tiny, and I don't think that they put the weight in their documentation, but I'm going to make a note of that to go and check the weight of item 31 just to get a better idea. So again, it's not
because
adding up.
Even item 45 up above, the weight of it was 173 point something grams. So that was pretty much telling you that that 45 was the entire fragment. And so, yeah, the only one in
45 didn't hit anything, didn't hit anybody. There was no blood, no DNA. There's nothing like that found on item 45.
Correct. It just went straight through the floor. Yeah.
Right. Whereas item 31, I'm just going to look that up again. I don't know if there was any DNA or anything found, or if it was even tested, to be honest. I think a lot of us really thought that we would get these DNA results and there would be a lot more testing than what we found here, and that's disturbing, very disturbing, at the lack of the DNA tests that were done here. Let's see if I can pull
And for those listening as well, the footnotes that Greg has in this book is very good. At the very back of the book, there's a source list of each of these chapters, and we're in chapter 5 now, and it shows which footnote, which lab report it was found on, and which page number it was. So it lets the user or the reader, go back and cross-reference.
Which has been very helpful, by the way, Greg.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That was yeah. I really hope that helps people to make it easy for them to just go and research whatever that sentence is there. But item 31 was not tested. I'm making a note of that to put that to add that to my book too, because why wouldn't they test that one? It seems pretty odd that they wouldn't do any DNA tests on item 31 as a bullet fragment. Maybe because it was a fragment, not a bullet. I don't know. Lots of problems there.
Yeah, can I talk about the very last paragraph you have under this section where it talks about the DNA profile in Joe Cooksley?
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, then it should be, that next paragraph.
For item 45?
Next one underneath.
Okay.
You scroll up, there you go. That one right there.
Okay.
Where it says, additionally, Joe Cooksley discussed running trajectory tests on the spent cartridge with BCA Special Agent Chris Olson. He didn't feel it was necessary, Cooksley wrote in his notes. Now, because I've always questioned why they didn't do any trajectory tests whatsoever on anything, which they should have done on the blood and everything else. But I find it interesting that he makes a note of only asking for this one particular item only. And of course, why did the agent say no to, they should have just done it on all of them. But, this tells me that they were fully aware of trajectory testing. And so why it wasn't done is my huge question to Joe Cooksley. Since wasn't he like the head from the BCA? Wasn't he kind of like lead?
Yeah, he was the team lead. Throughout.
Yeah. So I really found that interesting. So when I read that, I have that highlighted in your book. I all marked up, starred, and everything. So I'm like going, they did know, and they were fully aware that that's what they should be doing, and they talked about it, and then said no, they didn't feel it was necessary.
What? And there's no explanation of why they didn't feel it was necessary.
Yeah, because I could have told them exactly where the person was standing when that thing was fired, and if they were standing, were they kneeling, what position was the person in who fired that round into the ground, and that could have given them a whole bigger picture of actually what took place. And they don't feel that's necessary, and then Cooksley is like, okay. I have a huge problem with that.
Yeah, because this shows that they didn't do any trajectory tests, even though we have some people who were early on saying that they did do those tests. Dan, wasn't that mentioned, some strings pointing from somewhere? Wasn't it mentioned in the article, the City Pages one? Or it was mentioned somewhere about they went into the house 1 year later and there were strings still up. We've seen pictures of the house 1 year later.
Yeah, that may have been was that the Alex Wilkinson article on the New Yorker, or was it the Corey Zarowski article from the City Pages?
I'm not sure. I lean towards the City Pages one, but I'm not 100% sure.
I can pull it up quick. Go ahead.
Okay. But I thought that was, once again, I was, expecting them, I was expecting once we got these documents that we would see that, they would be able to kind of line up. Okay, David was standing here, and he shot Kamel here, he shot his wife here and he shot himself there. They don't have any of that.
And we know that's not true. We know that whoever wrote that completely fabricated that entire thing. How do we know that? Because we have photos of that house. We have photos of it just days or a month after. We have photos of it from after the cleaning crew took out the floor and painted over the wall. There are no strings anywhere. So if they weren't there a few days to a few weeks after, they certainly didn't see strings there a year later.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to the Gray Stage Podcast. Before we get started here, I just want to remind you that if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Very interesting. Yeah, that was just one more frustrating thing there. That they just didn't feel that anything was actually necessary. And what did they think was something necessary that they should do? There's not that much. They felt it was absolutely necessary to blame David for everything, but aside from that, it's hard to find anything else.
Yes, exactly. All of the evidence, as soon as they walk in, the evidence is pretty much screaming triple homicide. These people, all three of them were murdered. And then it to me, and this is my opinion, but to me it seems like then they go out of their way and then they have to convolute what they're finding to create a narrative, and then they have it and then they stick to it, and then they will only find something that could almost back up their narrative and then just walk away and tell everybody, you just have to accept what we're telling you. And the evidence is telling telling me at least, that what they are saying is it's an absolute lie. Because these are officers who know better. So to me, again, my opinion, I feel these officers are on purpose lying about what they're seeing and lying in their reports and lying in their conclusions. But why are they doing that? If they have no monkey in this circus, why would they go out of their way to blame a deceased person for a crime that the evidence is showing is impossible he could have committed?
And do we have Stephanie? Does Stephanie have a chance to join us yet? I don't know if she's here or not yet. But Stephanie, if you are there, go ahead and just let us know that, or else we'll keep moving along here. But so they leave the house with 6 casings, like we've talked about, 4 bullets here. So we've talked about item 42, 43, and 44, all tied to Kamel, to nobody else. There's a single source DNA on them. I mean, it just, that's baffling.
Yeah, the fragments they left, 3 with Kamel and 1 with Ranya's DNA, and nothing of David. They didn't leave with anything from David, and they've never found anything that connects David to a bullet.
Now, keep in mind that the test results were not back yet. So when they left that first day, they had 3 bullet fragments, right? Or 3 or 4.
Correct.
3 or 4, and they assumed that it was 1 for each person, and they were happy with that, and they left. Then they get the results back and say, well, 3 relates to Kamel, 1 relates to Rania, and we don't have any for David. Well, now we're at red alert level 3, third time that things don't make sense, and now we don't have the actual magic bullet of the mastermind, the killer, which is in my mind that's the most important bullet to have, and they never had it. Well, they got it a month later. But at the time that they left, just to point out, they did not know at that time who bullets related to who, and they just know that they had 3 in possession that were 3 or 4 that were bloody. Let's put it that way. The other one in the wall wasn't, but they still, like Greg said, it didn't match the number of casings. And the investigations that I have been researching, you always have to match those up. And so now if you're out in the woods shooting or out in the countryside, you're of course not going to match them up. But inside of a house setting like this, a residential area, you should be able to account for all of them.
Correct.
Unless they're, they should all be there. Typically, a single gunshot, you'll find a single casing. 2 gunshots, 2 casings, 2 bullets. In this case, they had 6 who walked out of there with 4, or even one could argue 5. But the answer needed to be 6, right?
Correct. Exactly.
So that's what the first level of frustration is for us citizen investigators. It's just, how come that wasn't addressed on day 1? Then when they get the lab results back, they realize they're still missing the 1. And so the questions on that I have, and I'm certainly no detective, but are those questions then raised by the detectives up to their boss or their Sergeant Gummert? And does he say, oh, let it go? Or does he push back and say, you know what, I want you guys to look into that further because it needs to tie. There needs to be the equal amount. So that's the kind of conversations that I'm really interested in. Or do they go up to the police chief or the captain? Or does any of this even get up above Gummert at all? Or at this point, are they either in on it and they don't care, or do they have their answer and they don't care? So that's my kind of questions as far as what level of conversation took place around that in their detective meetings, when they got together to meet, put all this together. Did any of these questions even come up is my question.
Well, yeah, and you bring up such good points, and it could very easily be argued that because and I know it's only one article, but this is what happens when you allow someone to quote you and then don't correct it. But when the chief stated that he knew within 2 hours, that David was guilty. He hadn't even, I don't even know if he, according to the login sheets, I don't think he was there. However, they didn't write in their notes, there was no note mentioned where, we're missing a fragment. We have this, they just list, what was found. There's actually nothing tying it together, so they're not doing that police work, that investigative work. So when they walk in, they have their narrative, and so the argument can be made that once they found out their narrative it just ran down the drain, but they're going to stick with it because they've already, by this point, put their foot in their mouth and blamed David to the public. They're not going to go back on that now, regardless of what the evidence is saying. Again, my opinion, and I'm saying this is an argument that can be made. So they are then just going to stick to their guns and just say, nope, he's guilty. Don't tell me, don't show me any proof that he's innocent because I said he's guilty.
And whereas I would argue that may be the case, but with these detectives like this, with the training that you go through, and in the city of Apple Valley, there is an average of basically 0 or 1 homicide per year. Here you get 3, and now you get to put your education and your training and your college education behind you to say, let's really dive into this. I'm guessing one or a couple of these detectives, I don't want to call them lower level, but they are, as far as Gummert's concerned, would have gone back and says, well, we still need to tie this out. This is what we need to do. I know that's publicly, obviously, he did it, is what they may have been thinking, but 1 + 1 still needs to equal 2. So I think at the detective level, I would have to guess that sooner or later someone brought that up, that some of this stuff doesn't match. Now, we know that it never got any farther because you get this chain of command issue, much like the military, where you don't go over and above your superior. And if he says, shut it down, you shut it down. But my gut tells me that there were some questions asked at that point, and somehow they all got negated somehow. And they said, let it go, or we don't have the time or energy to spend on this. But my gut tells me that someone along the way would have said to another detective, well, don't you think we should run this past Sergeant? Or go to Gummert himself and say, what do you think? Why aren't we doing these basic elementary steps in a huge murder case such as this? Now, homicide detectives are taught from day one, from the very first course they take, treat every suicide or homicide, treat every dead body as the murder of the century. You cannot take lightly anything. You treat it as if it's going to be mainstream news, headline news in the national news. You've got to treat every single homicide like that. In this case, it didn't appear to me that anyone really gave two shrugs of the shoulders about this case, and they were on to the next thing. And maybe that's where my frustration, I think, comes in, because that's the sense that I get, that nothing was treated with urgency. Nothing was treated with, you know what, let's go back and double check this. Let's get some assistance. Let's get some extra help. Let's get another set of eyes on this. And so my only conclusion is that he was either shut down from the beginning, or no one cared, or they were all in on it from the beginning. And any one of those situations, I have trouble with those answers. The fact that these are public employees, public servants working for your city, and this is how they act.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the whole thing is, like you said, this is when they walk in, all they know at that point, and all they can say with certainty, are there are 3 bodies on the floor. And to assume murder-suicide and then stick to that agenda regardless of what that evidence starts telling you as you're walking around, labeling it, marking it, writing it down, and then supposed to be investigating it, and then as the evidence starts to show you this is a triple homicide, and yet ignore all evidence and stick to whatever the narrative, how that narrative came to be and who came up with it. There has to, I agree, there has to have been some other officer that jumped in and said, this isn't making sense. We need to look at this again. And, I don't know how they work that chain of command. And as you can probably tell, I am not a chain of command follower. I am always that employee that says, no, you're wrong, if it's wrong. I'm like, no, you're wrong, and I'm not going to say it's right if it's wrong. So for me, I'm like, where are those officers? Where are they now, and why are they not speaking up? They had to have had questions. They had to have looked at that and said, maybe I could do this independently, or my boss is wrong, or something.
And just to jump in here for the listeners, once again for a visual, I guess, my background, my degree is in accounting, and my training is to account for everything. So I think that's why I take some of this kind of more of a zero tolerance level for some of these mistakes. If I was looking into a case of embezzlement or some bad checks by a small business that were written, and my boss said to me that we have $100,000 of missing funds, checks were written totaling $100,000 that we can't account for, and I come back and say, well, I have 3 checks for $25,000 each that I can account for, which total $75,000. If my boss says, okay, that sounds good, now we have proved the $100,000, I would still say, but we haven't. There's still one other check out there for $25,000 that we need to account for, that must have been written, must have went somewhere, must have been cashed, and cleared the bank somewhere. You need to track that down. We have to account for every check that's missing. You can't, and so that's where I get stuck from my background, because it's, for instance, my boss saying, well, we know that $100,000 of bad checks we've got 3 checks, there's probably one missing, but that's good enough, let's move forward. And that's where I say, but you don't. You would never ever go forward with that. If, for instance, in an embezzlement case, you would never do that. In this case, you're dealing with bullets and fragments. That number needs to tie out, and it doesn't. So my question is, if this is their background as detectives, who raised that question, or was it even raised? And my worst question yet, which has really let me down, is if the detectives did ask their boss, that's James Gummert's responsibility as their sergeant to say, you're right, go back, find the missing. We need to prove the case. That's his job. That's what he is paid for. That's his responsibility and his accountability. What I think happened was he says, we're close enough, let it go, let's move on to something else. And that's where my anger level rises, when I assume something like that took place at a city public servant.
Exactly. Oh, I feel it. And, you know, it's part of my background too. The last job I had, because I'm not working anymore, was a document control manager. I tracked documents. I created documents. I created a database to track the documents. I did all of that. I had to keep track of massive amount of information for a lot of different government contracting facilities that do defense work. Now, if one of our larger clients, you know, which I'm tracking it on a particular program we're working on. Now, if I had just told them, well, here's line, yeah, and they'd say, hey, where's line item such and such? I don't know. It just kind of, we lost track of it. You know, people in R&D don't know, so blah, 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 blah. Would that customer be okay with that? Not at all. You have to, like you were saying, same thing with accounting. You have to keep track of everything, explain how it got there, why it got there, why is it part of this, and it better fit in with the rest of what is going on. And when I'm looking at all of this data, I'm looking at all of these reports, and they do not line up. Nothing lines, okay, not nothing, not never use definitives, but the majority of it does not line up. And so these are huge red flags for me, and that's why I'm questioning every little thing I'm looking at, because by trying to make it, how it seems like they're trying to make it fit, it's almost like the opposite ends of a magnet. The more you try to push it together, the more it's trying to force itself apart, if that analogy makes any sense.
Yes, it does. So, well, I mean, what we keep getting left with here is it coincidental that there were just some random mistakes made along the way? And I think the answer more and more is no. There is no way, because this was done so poorly.
Correct.
That you can't come to that conclusion. We can only be left with it was either done on purpose or it was covered up, because what was the word? I've used this word before. The I'm not going to say the Keystone Cops, but the inadequacy of this entire thing was so bad, they could not. These guys could not have been this stupid.
Exactly.
So the problem is they did it on purpose, which could be the case. I can't rule it out at this juncture. Or they did do their best work and it was shut down from someone on the chain of command higher than them, which also a very good possibility. Or the last possibility is everyone on this effort did the best they could. I don't see that. I cannot. Right now, we can't say that happened. No one could be this dumb on an investigation that they failed this many times.
Exactly. A couple of them, would make
Correct.
sense.
And that's not even a shot on the detectives on the department. That is that we have so much evidence of failures that we're beyond the whole point of, are these things just coincidentally wrong? So now we're really going down a bad road, because the only two options left are they know about it and they didn't care, or they covered it up on purpose.
Exactly.
So we've got some, and this is a triple homicide involving a 5-year-old girl, which I don't think people understand the magnitude of this horrific event. I'll leave it at that.
Right, exactly. And I can only imagine the officers who first got there, well, actually any of the officers, so just anybody who walked in and saw that little baby on the floor. I can guarantee that every last one of them was just struck through the heart. I mean, you can't walk into a scene like that and see a child and then just go, oh, okay, well, whatever. So how did they go from seeing that innocent on the floor to being okay with not following up with all of the evidence? How can they, how did they do that then, and how are they continuing to do that today?
And how do they sleep at night is my question.
Yes. Yep.
So all fair questions, I suppose.
Yeah, I think another point is that these officers knew that they were leaving the house and they didn't have all of the bullets that they should have. Obviously, that's not SOP, right? That's not standard. So that goes back again to what you're saying. It's just like they can't be that dumb. Why would they leave the house? First of all, if they know that they leave the house, which Detective Sean McKnight actually recognizes that they knew that they could not count for several bullets that may have been fired from that gun. If they knew this, why... First of all, okay, so where does that lead them? Did that lead them to start looking at missing bullets, missing this, missing that? Because it doesn't sound like it, because they had no intention of coming back into that house. From everything that we're seeing here, it looks like they had no intention of coming back into that house once the crime scene was done. Once the cleaners were inside, they were pretty much done.
Yeah.
And yet we know that they will have to come back to that house twice. But I don't understand that. If they know that these numbers are not adding up, unless they're doing some Common Core math or something like that, these numbers are just simply not adding up. How do they justify leaving the house without the same number of bullets matched to these casings? And
Greg, the only thing I can say there, and Catherine, you can chime in. I had done a couple of interviews with the retired detective that's no longer working, but he reiterated to me several times that the general public has got to remember that this is just a job for these detectives. They still want to go home. They want to get to bed. It's been a long day. They've been at this crime scene the whole time. They've got a wife and kids to go home to, spouse. They're not going to stop everything just to solve a flippin' crime. They have a life to live, and they're getting a paycheck. So they want to get home, get into bed, and maybe they'll get up the next morning and look at it, but it's a Sunday morning. He made it sound like, you don't stop everything to solve a crime. You've been there extra hours. You're probably looking at your watch late in the evening, and you want to get out of it. Now, I don't like that tone, I guess, but he said that is what it is. You're there to get a paycheck and put food on the family for the table. You're not there to solve the crimes. Not many detectives are interested in being Sherlock Holmes and becoming famous for their job. They just want to do their job, punch the clock, and go home at the end of the day. And so I think that also is partly true from some of these detectives. I can't assume that's the case, but this was a fact that it was a long day on a Saturday. All day long they were there. And so now it's in past midnight. Does Sean McKnight care if they're a couple bullets short? I don't think so. And that's a sad sight, and I don't think the public understands that, but a retired detective that I spoke with says they're there just punching the clock like the next guy. They do not want overtime, just as an office worker does not want to be told by their boss, we need to come in this weekend and work. Very, very same, very similar. So did they say, hey, boys, let's wrap it up, let's head home, and you know what, let's get a fresh start in the morning and come back and look for that bullet? I don't know if that actually took place. I tend to agree with Greg that I think by the time they packed it up that night and left, they were into the concept that, the BCA was going to handle the rest, and we were going to be more of a filling out forms and assisting on the rest of the investigation. But the main heavy lifting was essentially done. I don't know if they had thoughts of coming back early the next morning after getting some shut-eye to continue the investigation. I believe they wrapped it up. I have no way to prove that, but I also don't think that these guys lost any sleep that night wondering if they're going to find the missing bullets or not. They may have lost sleep for the sight that they saw as far as the mental images, but were they worried about going to bed that night and not having the right amount of bullets? That's the one thing, that's the concept that I fear the most, because this is not a normal job. Being a policeman is not a normal job. You are a public servant. You are a servant to the public. You decided to take this oath to get into this line of work. The rest of us didn't. We all got regular 8-to-5 jobs. But because you took that oath to serve your city, I think that's where you take that extra level. You got to take that extra level to then stay up all night or do what it takes to find the answers or bring in another agency to find those answers. I don't believe that's a good enough answer to say, I've had a long day, I want to head home and have a nice hearty meal and go to bed. But that's generally the way he made it sound.
Do you think they kind of pushed it off on the BCA? Because remember, we got the BCA there too. You have the Apple Valley. You have sheriff's deputies there too. So you got all these different people there. Are they kind of just hoping the other one would kind of solve it? Because the BCA is pretty much done. Once they leave, they don't come back. No, I take that back. They do come back days later, 1 month later, but they're pretty much done. The Apple Valley police are there on January 18th, on the following day, taking out guns. So they're still there taking out stuff. So if they were going to look for any other bullets, if they had any plans to look for any other bullets, they had a great chance to. The fact that they know that they leave the house on January 17th knowing that they can't count for all of these bullets, and they're back there the following day, to me it seems like they have no intention of looking for any other bullets, which is a big problem. That does not make sense at all. It's one more reason to reopen the case.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Just as an example, one of the ride-alongs that I did with my friend who is the deputy coroner, and it was a single person. I think I've mentioned this case before. It was a single person gunshot. They were shot multiple times, and when it was a similar situation where, they had been looking for hours for a spent bullet. Same thing, cartridges, but not enough bullet fragments to go along. And they spent hours and they just couldn't do it, right? They couldn't find it. So they finally go back out to the van, and then they're looking at their photos, and then they see a part on the body where they hadn't noticed that this person had been shot. So then they're like, oh, that's probably where it is. So what they did at that point is then they contacted the coroner and the police department and said, hey, I think we found it, and I think it's still in the body, and blah, 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 blah. So as they're doing the autopsy, they do find the extra fragment that was, quote unquote, missing from the scene. But this person was noting that it was missing, was noting that, we have X amount of casings, we have X amount of fragments, and they're not matching, we're still looking. And I don't see any of that in any of these reports. Not one officer wrote that down.
Sean McKnight actually mentions it 1 month later.
Oh, a month later, yeah.
1 month later. But yeah, and that's only because it's kind of like now they're covering up. Maybe not covering up. Maybe that's not the right word. But now they're kind of doing some backtracking. They don't mention it before, but now that they know, now that somebody has shown them that there is a bullet that they missed, they start covering up their tracks instead of saying, you know what, we were totally wrong, blah, 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 let's do something. I don't know what you would do at that point. You can't start over. Of course, at this point, they still hadn't done any other tests. The tests weren't done. There was still a lot that had not happened. A lot of the testing, all that stuff, even talking to family, all that stuff doesn't start till at least 1 or 2 months later. So by that time, it's kind of like, well, let's just hope that nobody figures out that we forgot a bullet that rolled out of the carpet, for one thing, which is another ridiculous thing. And let's forget that we forgot a bullet that was in the attic. There's some huge problems there.
Now, if one scenario that may come into play, if there was, in this case, all gunshots to the head, I could see the detective saying, you know what, the remaining ones are maybe lodged inside of the head or inside the bodies somewhere. Now, there was no damage to the body parts, and in this case, there was no noticeable heads even left, except for Ranny. So I can't see that even coming into play either by saying, maybe during the autopsy we'll find the missing fragment. Yeah. You see that kind of a situation like that. But this case, it really wasn't, the heads weren't there, and there was no gunshot wounds to any of those 3 bodies from the neck down. So there was little to nothing to speculate on at that point. But yes, Greg, that month later when they came back and found that they were off by that bullet in the attic, then I think fully they were in a cover-up mode at that point. Covering themselves up,
CYA.
Yes, they were in CYA mode at that point because then the math didn't tie out. And so they had to keep pushing and dragging their feet and kicking the can down the road until it just went away.
Yep.
They weren't counting on us, and apparently they really weren't.
You little troublemakers.
Well, I wasn't counting on us either, to be honest. You know, I didn't think we would have to take it this far, but apparently we do, and that's just the way that things are. My only last point on item 31 is it's still okay if it's a bullet fragment. Let's say that this is a bullet. The cases don't match because they come back 2 separate times and find 2 extra bullets. So that would put the bullet count at 7 and the casings at 6. So they don't really explain item 31. Weird thing is, I believe item 31 is the item that they use to compare to the bullet found in the attic later on. So there's still, I mean, now do we have an extra casing? Is there a casing missing here? I mean, any way that I look at this, these numbers are, the casings and the bullets are not adding up. Something is missing. Unless they can show that item 31 was part of one of these other bullets. But if that's true, then why did they compare item 57, the bullet found 1 month later, to item 31? And I'm guessing by this time they're just thinking people have moved on to other things, move on to other cases, and they won't ask these simple questions.
Right, and it doesn't make sense because by that point they already had a test-fired cartridge from the gun that they found at the scene. Why did they not test item 31 against 1? Why did they not test 57 against 1? They do, against each other. So, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. How they did this doesn't make sense at all. And, yeah. Oh.
Well, and then they have item 7, which is the unspent round that was found there too, and that one really never gets talked about. And it's just found there, and I'll pull up where exactly item 7 was found, which is another interesting area too. So item 7 is again found closer to where David was, where David's feet would be most likely. No, actually no. It is not where David's feet would be. It is. Okay, it is. It's kind of on the side of where, it's way on the other side there. So by David's left hand, closest to his left hand. Kind of close to the gun too. But that one also doesn't make sense. It kind of looks like somebody stepped on item 7. I'll pull that one up here too.
Yeah, and so, and looking at that, that's what caught my attention too, was when you wrote that item 7 is the unspent round compressed into the living room carpet. And when you look at that, it does. It looks like someone had to have stepped on it. It doesn't look like that little dog had enough weight to quote unquote compress that unspent round into the carpet, because it's in there pretty good when you look at it. But yet again, did it jam and they had to clear the gun, or was it something they were holding and they dropped it and didn't know it, and as they're walking around, they meaning the killers, and then they stepped on it and just didn't even know and ignored it? But this item 7 is just out of place in so many ways. Yeah. And
it's one more thing that is not tested.
Yep.
Now, is that standard? I mean, if you find a bullet there, I mean, I don't understand that. Why test some bullets and not the other? Either test all of them, like you're saying, test them all, or test nothing, right? It doesn't make sense. I don't get that. I was trying to see if I have anything else here. I think I've basically covered everything that I wanted to cover here. I don't know if you guys have any points here. I'll see if anyone in the chat wants to make any points. We have Derek Davis that's joined us in the live chat room here, making some good points. I've chatted with Derek, and he's the one who kind of got my mind thinking about, well, okay, where these casings are found, that should pretty much help us understand where the gun was fired from, where these shots came from. And the more that I looked at it, it's just a head scratcher where nothing is adding up. Any way that I slice it, like I said, anyway, it is not adding up. So.
Yeah, and that's the point too, and I'm glad someone else sees it as well, because that's what I was saying earlier. When you see the casing number 30, you know that since his gun ejects to the right, he had to, whoever fired a weapon, because they're trying to say it was David. We know that's not true, but he would have had to have been standing facing the door and the Christmas tree. You look see where casing number 3 is. Whoever fired that would have to be standing facing the kitchen. Number 2, where that was at, would have to be pretty close to the recliner, facing the wall and the bodies. They're moving. There's constant movement, and so. And this doesn't even, again, this should be a major bell going off in their head. Whoever is shooting is moving. So then they had to have had either moving targets, or they're just deciding to walk around and shoot for who knows whatever reason. But these casings are telling them movement took place, and they don't even think they don't bat an eye at that.
They don't even talk about when I hear you say that, I keep thinking multiple shooters. You have a shooter from the front door and a shooter from the back door. That's just kind of what keeps coming back into my head. Multiple shooters while they're pretty much caught there. You have a lot of problems with that, because the neighbors who heard shots, and the dates that they heard shots are very different, but we're talking about at least 6 or 7 shots here. Nobody's hearing that many shots.
Nope.
The 2 neighbors who talk about, hearing the rapid fire shots, well, rapid fire shots to me also show this could be several shooters, or possibly David shooting back too, which again shows more proof of intruder, not David killing everyone. There's nothing here that shows that David did any of this. So how they walk into this crime scene and think that David did this is very baffling until you start looking at who they questioned, what the people that they questioned said, and what it seemed like family, friends, that there was a lot of them that were pretty much leading this story, leading the case, when that shouldn't have been happening. The police should not have been taking them at their word, and it looks like that's what they were doing. David was crazy and snapped, and that's what the police chief or the police captain later says. They think David snapped, went to a dark place, and killed them all.
Yeah, and and that to me just screams someone who is either trying to be a writer or has been watching far too many quote-unquote crime scene movies or whatever, because people, they don't just snap. And that's, if you talk to any professional psychologist, therapist, PhD in this field, they will tell you, it's someone like David, he had no history. People who quote-unquote just snap, they have a history. There's a build-up to that behavior, right? There's triggers, there's major losses, blah, 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 blah. Nobody, David just didn't one day go, I'm going to kill everybody, and I'm just going to do away with all of us. And that's what they want us to believe. And
right,
that is not human nature.
Yeah, based on David's views, based on what he was working on, based on Gray State, is what they're really saying. That took him to a very dark place, and all of this happened. Nobody else was worried about David going into a dark place from 2011, when this project first started, up until 2015, even after his death. Nobody was really worried about this project taking David to a very dark place until he was dead, and until they could actually do something with David's project. Then, all of a sudden, he went to a dark place. It's sad, it's tragic, but let's go ahead and still make money off of David's project, and
Right.
that'll be it. You know, I mean, he's a child killer, he's a wife killer, but yeah, you know, let's go ahead and do something with it.
And it's horrible that every last one of them all jumped on that bandwagon together. And, you know, here's somebody that they're saying, oh, he's my friend, oh, I spent all this time with him, you know, and immediately jump on the wagon and start screaming, oh, he did this, he's a horrible person. And another thing that irritates me about this case are those who keep bringing up, well, you know, he went to a dark place the last time he was writing, and he's like, the next time I don't do that. You guys know the story. And so now they're trying to say that's what he was doing this time. He must have gone to a dark place because like he did the last time. And to me, that entire conversation is taken out of context. Now, if you're a writer and you were writing something that you're really into, okay, when I actually moved states for a while, I left my home and moved to Oklahoma for 2 years to finish a book. And when I was in the depths of writing this book and getting it done, I didn't eat for days. I sat up writing 24/7, and that's the quote-unquote dark place. It's like, man, I was so involved, and I don't see anything. I forget anything's there. I forget food is supposed to be eaten, and I'm supposed to sleep. And they then turn around and they take David's statement and make it about how he was mentally unstable. He was saying he was afraid. And then that fits the narrative of he snapped. When in reality, you know, it could totally have been, you know, his dark place was, oh man, I went 2 days without showering or 3 days without showering. I was so into writing, I couldn't see anything else. Don't let me do that again.
Right.
And that's a far cry from what.
Yeah, because he didn't kill anybody those other times that he was going into this dark place and everything. There was he didn't have any issues then. So why all of a sudden would they think that, okay, yeah, that totally makes sense?
Right.
You know, it's crazy. Derek is also saying that he'd like to see the picture that shows that the hole in the ceiling the day they were there. I know we've talked about that. I still have not heard because of, you know, everything that's happening. The Apple Valley Police Department have promised that they would get me that photo. I'm still waiting for it. So that's where I stand. I know both of you probably stand. You probably lean a little bit to a more certainty.
It's been 5 years and you don't have it. I don't think it exists.
They could Photoshop it at this point and just make it. You know,
yeah, at this stage of the game, they probably should.
Well, I mean, that's the other thing is like, okay, they should have just said, okay, well, we don't have it, or we'll get it to you. What they did was first they sent me a picture of the basement, of a hole in the basement, and I said, no, that's not the right one. So then they sent me a picture of the hole in the living room that was taken 1 month later. So I don't know why they would do that. I don't know. Do they not know what the difference is?
Oh, they do.
They have. Who was the officer? Was it Bone? Detective Bone? Either Bone or Booth that said that they went back and they looked at those photos and they realized that there was a bullet hole there. Maybe they looked at the photo from 1 month later.
Well, and it's really funny because in the writing when item 57 was found, the writing is very clear. It states, it was brought to Detective Bone's attention that there was a hole in the ceiling. That tells you he didn't know about a hole in the ceiling.
Correct.
This is where we get, Greg, to the concept of kicking the can down the road. They know exactly what they're doing.
Well, they're not very nice for that.
Nope.
Anything else, you guys here? I'm just checking the chat. Derek, if you have any other comments or any other questions that you'd like to ask here before we shut this down, go ahead and put those in the chat room now. But Dan or Catherine, any final words here?
Nope, nothing from myself.
Nope, nothing here. I just, again, not blowing smoke up your hiney side, but I really think you did a great job with this book, and it's been very helpful.
Yes, I couldn't agree more.
Excellent.
Very well done.
All right. Well, with that, we'll shut this one down here, and next time we'll come back, and the next topic will be the focus on the blood wall and the Quran. We'll talk about those, and maybe we've already talked about the knife, so I think if we focus on the blood wall, the Quran, and then we can move on to some of the other things. This is a pretty long chapter, so we still haven't talked about the floor blood stains and some of the other items that were found in the living room. So maybe we can get all of that done in 1 hour show next time.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Look forward to it.
All right.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for joining, and God bless you all. Until next time.
The Gray Stage by Greg Fernandez Jr., Mind by Soul Productions, 2020. United States Army veteran and Minnesota filmmaker David Crowley was accused of murdering his wife and daughter before taking his own life in December of 2014. The Apple Valley Police Department suspects the bodies were inside the Minnesota home for 3 weeks after they were found by neighbors on January 17, 2015. Within 24 hours of finding the bodies, authorities assumed this was a double murder-suicide. The culprit was deceased, and the public was not in any danger. On the day the bodies were found, authorities did not see a bullet hole in the living room ceiling or a bullet in the living room carpet. These were two of the most important items in this case, as they were tied to David Crowley and his daughter. It was only after investigators were told of their existence that they returned to the crime scene on 2 separate occasions and retrieved the 2 spent rounds. What did authorities find in the Crowley house that proved David Crowley murdered his wife and daughter and then killed himself? Without a motive, and with the absence of guilt, the case was closed with the status of exceptionally clear. If David is truly guilty of this crime, then authorities should be forced to prove their theory. The Gray Stage exists solely because of the official conclusion as stated on page 92 of the Apple Valley Police Reports PDF. With the conclusion of the review of digital devices, Detective Brian Bone reported on October 7, 2015, there is no other information available for further investigation. Throughout this investigation, the AVPD has not discovered any information or evidence that shows anybody but David Crowley is the perpetrator of these crimes, including the killing of his wife, child, and himself. This book, The Gray Stage, is a direct response to the allegations against David Crowley. Due to the lack of evidence against David, I felt it necessary to write this book. One of the reasons I decided to write The Gray Stage was to help convince the Apple Valley Police Department to reopen case number 1500303. Either the Apple Valley Police Department should be forced to prove David Crowley guilty, or they should admit the case is unsolved. Because the official investigation failed to prove David Crowley guilty, I can only assume he is not. What other conclusion could I possibly reach under the current circumstances?